The night sky over Hanoi was silent, save for the faint hum of generators and the muffled whisper of anti-aircraft crews scanning the black horizon. In the city below, the streets were cloaked in darkness. Power had been cut to make the capital vanish from the air. Families huddled in underground shelters, clutching one another in anticipation of another raid, though no one knew that what was coming would eclipse anything they had yet endured. A low rumble began to roll across the sky, distant at first, like thunder beyond the mountains. It deepened, multiplied, and grew until the ground itself began to tremble. The sound was not natural. It was mechanical, rhythmic, and unrelenting. Then, for a moment, the darkness tore open. From 40,000 feet above, a formation of B-52 Stratofortresses, each the size of a small office building, released their payloads. The bombs fell in perfect geometric patterns, each plume of fire illuminating the next. In seconds, the horizon transformed into a wall of orange light. Shockwaves rippled through the air, flattening trees, bridges, and anti-air batteries. An officer in the North Vietnamese Air Defense Command would later describe it as a sunrise that came from the west. For nearly 15 minutes, the sky glowed with an intensity so fierce that even soldiers in bunkers miles away could read by its light. It was as if day had been reborn, a man-made dawn over a city at war. Above the chaos, the B-52s flew in precise, unwavering formation. Their radar jammers pulsed through enemy frequencies, masking their exact positions. Below them, Soviet-supplied SA-2 guideline missiles streaked upward, leaving trails of white smoke that arced toward the glow. The Americans called it Operation Linebacker II. To the Vietnamese on the ground, it was something else entirely, a nightmare that defied belief. When the last explosions faded and the city fell back into darkness, the silence was absolute. Smoke blanketed Hanoi like fog. The only sound that remained was the faint hiss of fires consuming what was left. In that silence, North Vietnamese commanders realized this was no ordinary raid. This was the opening strike of a new kind of air war. A war not just of destruction, but of psychological dominance. By the winter of 1972, the United States was desperate to end its longest and most politically divisive war. Nearly a decade of airstrikes, troop deployments, and failed peace talks had yielded no lasting solution. The Nixon administration wanted leverage, something that could break Hanoi's will to fight and force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table in Paris. That leverage came in the form of a weapon designed not just for war, but for deterrence: the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. Originally conceived in the early 1950s as a nuclear bomber capable of reaching the Soviet Union, the B-52 was never meant for the jungles of Indochina. It was a creature of the Cold War, a steel symbol of atomic might, built to deliver destruction on a planetary scale. Yet by 1965, as the Vietnam conflict deepened, the U.S. Air Force began adapting the bomber for conventional warfare. Its immense payload, up to 30 tons of bombs, made it ideal for blanket strikes over dense terrain and hardened targets. To Washington strategists, the B-52 represented a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. It could erase entire grid squares from a map. Its shockwaves felt miles away. In theory, such overwhelming force would shatter the enemy's morale. But in practice, Vietnam had defied every theory. The North Vietnamese had endured years of air raids, losing thousands of soldiers and civilians. Yet their resistance only grew stronger. By late 1972, peace negotiations had stalled. Hanoi demanded total U.S. withdrawal and political concessions in the South. President Nixon, furious, turned to what his advisors called the hammer. The idea was brutal in its simplicity, hit the North so hard with such concentrated fury that they would have no choice but to return to the table. But this was not simply a return to bombing. It was a demonstration, a message not only to Hanoi, but to Moscow and Beijing, that America still held the power to project overwhelming, unstoppable force anywhere on Earth. Operation Linebacker II would be unlike any previous campaign, an air offensive designed to replicate the psychological terror once reserved for nuclear war without crossing that final threshold. It was, in every sense, the Cold War made visible in fire. The B-52 Stratofortress was conceived not in the jungles of Asia, but in the anxious laboratories of post-war America, a world shadowed by mushroom clouds and the uneasy balance of atomic deterrence. In 1946, as the ashes of World War II still smoldered, the U.S. Army Air Forces issued a request for a new long-range bomber. It needed to be capable of carrying nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory and returning without refueling. The challenge was staggering, a machine that could fly higher, farther, and faster than anything ever built, while carrying a payload measured in tens of thousands of pounds. Boeing engineers, led by Ed Wells and George Scherer, began sketching ideas that bordered on science fiction. Early models resembled propeller-driven giants like the B-29, but the advent of jet propulsion changed everything. In 1948, during a critical meeting in Dayton, Ohio, Air Force generals demanded a radical redesign, one that could outrun Soviet interceptors and fly beyond radar detection. Overnight, Boeing's team scrapped months of work and began again. Within a week, they returned with a sleek, swept-wing design powered by 8 jet engines. That aircraft would become the B-52A, the prototype of a legend. Its first flight on April 15, 1952, marked a new epoch in aviation. Stretching nearly half a football field in length and with a wingspan of 185 feet, the Stratofortress was both elegant and terrifying, an airborne cathedral of aluminum and fuel. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the B-52 evolved into the backbone of Strategic Air Command, SAC, America's nuclear strike arm. Crews trained relentlessly, ready to launch at a moment's notice if Soviet missiles appeared on radar. The bomber's endurance was nearly mythical. With aerial refueling, it could stay aloft for 24 hours or more, circling the Arctic in silent patrols. Each plane carried hydrogen bombs powerful enough to erase a city. By the early 1960s, as Cold War tensions rose, the B-52 became a symbol of global reach, the embodiment of America's doctrine of massive retaliation. Yet it was also a paradox. Designed to deter war, it now found itself repurposed for one. When U.S. involvement in Vietnam deepened, the Pentagon faced a strategic dilemma: how to fight an asymmetric guerrilla war with weapons built for nuclear apocalypse. The answer, improvised and controversial, was to adapt the B-52 into a conventional bomber, capable of delivering thousands of smaller bombs instead of one devastating atomic payload. The result was the B-52D, modified for carpet bombing with advanced navigation radar and electronic countermeasures. What had once been a doomsday machine was now a tactical hammer, used to destroy supply routes, jungle encampments, and entire industrial zones. In a war without front lines, the Stratofortress became both omnipresent and invisible, soaring miles above the clouds, its targets unaware until the sky itself exploded. To understand why the B-52 terrified even the most hardened North Vietnamese commanders, one must look beyond its sheer size and payload. Its true power lay in its systems, a fusion of analog computers, radar-guided precision, and electronic deception that transformed a flying fortress into a machine of surgical devastation. Each B-52 carried a crew of 6: pilot, co-pilot, radar navigator, electronic warfare officer, and gunner. From their positions deep within the aircraft's dimly lit cabin, surrounded by green glowing dials and the steady hum of avionics, they commanded a machine capable of orchestrating destruction with mathematical accuracy. The heart of the operation was the AN/APQ-113 and AN/APQ-120 radar systems, which allowed the bomber to fly blind through clouds and darkness. These systems scanned the terrain below, building a radar image of the ground that could be matched against preloaded mission maps. The radar navigator used this information to guide the aircraft to within a few hundred meters of its designated strike zone, a stunning feat for the 1960s and 70s. For Linebacker II, this precision was multiplied by scale. Dozens of B-52s flew in tight, staggered formations known as cells, each separated by only seconds of flight time. The bombers used electronic countermeasure pods like the ALQ-117 to jam enemy radar frequencies, throwing North Vietnamese surface-to-air missile SAM guidance systems into chaos. From below, the sky appeared alive with false signals, decoys, and ghost echoes, a digital storm that blinded Hanoi's defenses. Then came the payload. A fully loaded B-52 could carry up to 108 bombs, each 750 pounds, distributed across an internal bay and under wing racks. When dropped in sequence, they produced an impact pattern known as the carpet. Within that rectangle of destruction, typically 1 mile wide and 2 miles long, nothing survived. Ammunition depots, anti-aircraft positions, bridges, and entire neighborhoods vanished in seconds. Crews trained obsessively for these missions. They practiced high-altitude approaches, evasive turns, and synchronized releases down to the second. Inside, the sensation was both routine and surreal, a calm, procedural rhythm punctuated by the distant flicker of explosions 8 miles below. To the men who flew them, the Stratofortress was a paradox. It was both archaic and advanced, a machine born of slide rules and rivets, yet capable of electronic warfare decades ahead of its time. Its engines, 8 Pratt & Whitney J-57s, roared with 13,250 pounds of thrust each, enabling it to climb above 40,000 feet. Its massive wings flexed under stress, bending like those of a bird before snapping back into shape. From a distance, it moved with ghostly grace. But for those on the ground, the sound alone was unforgettable. The layered roar of dozens of bombers could be heard long before the first explosion. It was the sound of inevitability. By late 1972, the skies over North Vietnam had become a vast invisible chessboard, each move tracked by radar, each counter measured in seconds. For the Americans, the B-52 represented the ultimate high ground. For the North Vietnamese, it was a celestial enemy that seemed untouchable. Yet beneath that imbalance lay one of the most sophisticated air defense systems ever assembled outside the Soviet Union. Hanoi was ringed by layers of protection. Soviet-supplied SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, stood ready in concealed launch sites, their tall, white fuselages gleaming faintly under camouflage nets. Each missile could climb to 60,000 feet and reach speeds of Mach 3, theoretically fast enough to strike a B-52. Alongside them operated thousands of anti-aircraft guns, from mobile 37mm batteries to the massive radar-directed 100mm cannons positioned around the capital. The North Vietnamese Air Defense Command, established with heavy Soviet and Chinese support, had spent years studying American bombing patterns. Their radar operators learned to anticipate flight paths, plotting altitudes and approach angles on large plastic overlays. In underground command centers, officers watched blips of light appear and vanish, sometimes hundreds at once, as they coordinated missile launches through tangled phone lines and shouted orders. Yet the B-52 presented a unique problem. Flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet, protected by electronic jammers, it was nearly immune to conventional flak. Even when radar operators managed to track one, the aircraft's decoy signals and chaff clouds filled the screens with noise. For every missile that found a target, several more vanished into the sky, chasing phantoms. Still, the Vietnamese adapted. They moved their SAM batteries constantly, turning rice paddies and village clearings into temporary launch sites. Soviet advisors helped recalibrate radar frequencies to cut through American jamming. Spotters on rooftops and mountain ridges relayed warnings by radio when they saw the telltale contrails of approaching bombers. The pilots of the Vietnamese People's Air Force, flying MiG-21s and MiG-19s, knew the odds were hopeless. The B-52s flew too high and too fast for dogfights, but their presence inspired a defiant form of resistance. In the words of one MiG pilot, "We could not touch them, but we could make them afraid to fly here again." Each night became a duel between human intuition and mechanical supremacy. American crews trusted radar screens and electronic pulses. Vietnamese defenders trusted instinct, experience, and luck. And as the raids intensified, both sides paid a mounting price. In the December skies, Hanoi burned, but so did the illusion of invincibility. For the first time, B-52s began to fall. Columns of fire marked their deaths as missiles found gaps in the American defenses. The bomber, once thought untouchable, was bleeding. It began just before midnight, on December 18, 1972. The first wave of B-52s crossed the Laotian border at 30,000 feet, invisible against the black sky. Beneath them stretched the Red River Delta, dense with radar installations, anti-aircraft guns, and the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. Their mission: to obliterate North Vietnam's ability to wage war. Rail yards, power plants, communication hubs, and the airfields protecting Hanoi and Haiphong. For 11 nights, the United States would unleash its most concentrated display of aerial firepower since World War II. The opening strike was massive: 129 B-52s, escorted by F-4 Phantoms and Wild Weasel aircraft designed to hunt radar sites. Each bomber carried 27 tons of ordnance, timed to hit in cascading intervals so that the explosions would merge into a continuous roar. From below, it looked like the heavens had cracked open. North Vietnam responded instantly. Searchlights cut through the sky like white lances as Soviet-made SA-2 missiles arced upward by the dozen. Their fuel trails glowed ghostly green against the night. On radar screens aboard the bombers, the missile returns looked like fireflies, dozens moving at once, each potentially lethal. For the first 3 nights, the Americans suffered unexpected losses. On December 20th alone, 6 B-52s were destroyed, many by improved Vietnamese radar coordination. Crewmen ejected into enemy territory, their parachutes illuminated by the fires of their falling aircraft. In the darkness below, villagers watched in awe as the giants that had terrorized their skies finally came apart in mid-air. Inside the cockpits, discipline was absolute. The radar navigator called out release points in a steady voice as missiles exploded outside. The pilots held formation. They could not deviate without breaking the bombing pattern. Some B-52s were hit, yet they stayed the course, their wings aflame. One crewman later recalled, "We were flying through a wall of fire, and the only thing more frightening than turning back was not finishing the mission." The losses forced a reevaluation. By the 4th night, tactics changed. The Air Force began varying flight paths, altitudes, and timing to confuse enemy radar. Electronic jamming was intensified, and decoy flights were added to draw missiles away. The results were immediate. Losses dropped sharply, while target accuracy improved. By December 26th, remembered as the night of the big raid, the operation reached its climax. Over 200 B-52s struck simultaneously in a coordinated assault on Hanoi and Haiphong. The shockwaves shattered windows 20 miles away. The roar was so continuous that residents later described it as the earth-breathing fire. When the campaign ended 3 days later, the results were staggering. The bombers had dropped over 20,000 tons of explosives in just 11 days. Rail lines, fuel depots, and command centers were leveled. Hanoi's infrastructure lay in ruins. More than 1,600 sorties had been flown, and despite the loss of 15 B-52s, the U.S. declared the mission a strategic success. In early January 1973, North Vietnam returned to the peace table in Paris. Within weeks, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, setting the stage for an American withdrawal. Washington celebrated the bombing campaign as proof of air power's decisive potential. Hanoi, though battered, called it a victory of survival, the moment when their people endured the most technologically advanced attack in history and did not break. For those who lived through it, the memory was seared into the mind. Nights when the sky itself became a weapon, and when courage meant standing beneath a storm that turned night into day. The 11 nights of Operation Linebacker II were not merely a series of air raids. They were the visible tip of an immense industrial and logistical iceberg. Behind every B-52 that thundered over Hanoi stood an empire of coordination. Engineers, radar technicians, refueling crews, factory workers, and planners who transformed American industry into a weapon of precision and endurance. At the heart of this machine was Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, a remote island that became the most active airfield in the world during December 1972. Every 2 hours, Stratofortresses lifted from its runways, heavy with fuel and ordnance, climbing slowly into the Pacific night. Each round trip to North Vietnam spanned nearly 7,000 miles and lasted more than 10 hours. Crews flew in rotating shifts, sustained by a rhythm as mechanical as the aircraft themselves. To keep this airborne armada aloft required staggering quantities of fuel. Millions of gallons of JP-4 jet fuel were burned during the campaign. Tankers from the U.S. mainland and Japan ferried supplies nonstop. At Anderson's munitions depot, forklifts and cranes loaded thousands of 750-pound bombs into waiting racks. The airfield never slept. Its runways glowed red from continuous takeoffs. Supporting this were smaller forward bases, U Tapao and Udon Thani in Thailand, and Korat, where maintenance crews worked under floodlights to repair battered bombers returning from missions. Mechanics replaced scorched panels, rewired damaged systems, and patched holes from shrapnel and SAM fragments, often with little more than aluminum sheets and speed tape. The pace was relentless. Downtime was measured in hours, not days. In the Pentagon's underground command centers, analysts monitored the campaign using real-time radio intercepts and reconnaissance photographs. Each strike was cross-referenced, recalculated, and fed into new mission plans for the following night. Computers, still primitive by modern standards, helped optimize bombing routes, radar jamming frequencies, and formation timing. The scale of data and coordination bordered on the unimaginable for its era. And behind it all stood American industry itself, a vast, humming organism. Factories in Seattle, Wichita, and Fort Worth continued to produce aircraft parts and replacement engines. Electronics firms like Westinghouse and Collins Radio supplied the radar and countermeasure equipment that kept the bombers alive. Every explosion over Hanoi was, in a sense, the echo of millions of man-hours of labor and invention. To the U.S. military establishment, Linebacker II reaffirmed the concept of industrial warfare, that technological and logistical superiority could compensate for the fog and chaos of combat. Yet, as planners celebrated efficiency and output, the moral equation grew murkier, because in Hanoi, efficiency meant precision, and precision meant devastation. When the smoke cleared over Hanoi, the irony was impossible to ignore. The B-52, conceived to prevent nuclear war, had fulfilled its destiny not as a deterrent, but as an instrument of relentless destruction. Its very existence, meant to keep peace through fear, had instead been used to wage one of the most intense bombing campaigns in human history. In the days following Linebacker II, journalists who entered Hanoi described a city half buried in rubble. Hospitals, factories, and schools lay shattered beside rail lines and bridges. Civilians sifted through the ruins for family members, their faces illuminated by the dull orange glow of smoldering fires. To the survivors, the raid felt less like a military operation and more like a cosmic event, something beyond the realm of ordinary war. And yet amid the devastation, there was a strange symmetry. For all the precision, for all the technology and planning, the B-52 had not broken the will of the North Vietnamese. The campaign had hastened negotiations, yes, but it had not conquered belief. Hanoi still stood. The government still functioned. The bomber had demonstrated America's ability to destroy, but not its ability to decide the future. Many U.S. pilots returned home uneasy. They had executed their missions flawlessly, but some confessed to a gnawing sense of dissonance, the feeling that their mastery of machinery had outpaced the morality of its use. Historian Bernard Fall had once written that modern warfare was becoming a conflict where technology fights ideology and ideology endures longer. Linebacker II seemed proof of that truth. Even U.S. officials saw the contradiction. Henry Kissinger would later remark that power projection is not persuasion. The bombs had spoken in thunder, but what they said was ambiguous. The North Vietnamese saw survival as victory, the Americans' withdrawal as success. In that divide lay the enduring paradox of the modern age, where overwhelming force achieves everything except meaning. Half a century later, the B-52 still flies, older than many of the pilots who command it, older even than the Cold War that birthed it. Its persistence is not an accident. It is a testament to an era when engineering sought permanence, and when strategic power was measured not in elegance, but in endurance. After Vietnam, the B-52 became a survivor of shifting doctrines. When stealth, precision, and drones redefined warfare, the Stratofortress refused to fade. Instead, it adapted. New avionics replaced analog dials, GPS replaced maps, digital countermeasures replaced magnetic tape. In the 1991 Gulf War, the same model that had once terrorized Hanoi flew missions over Iraq, launching cruise missiles with accuracy unimaginable in 1972. Again in Afghanistan, 2001, and Iraq, 2003, it reappeared, now striking Taliban caves and desert strongholds with guided bombs from 20 miles away. The bomber's endurance speaks to something deeper than metal or machinery. It embodies the enduring philosophy of strategic air power, the belief that control of the skies can shape the ground below. Yet each new war has revived the same haunting question first asked over Hanoi. How much destruction is enough to change a mind? Modern air campaigns still echo the logic of Linebacker II: precision-guided munitions, satellite surveillance, and real-time data promise clean wars. Yet the moral tension remains. The more exact the strike, the easier it becomes to forget its human cost. Drones now hover where B-52s once roared, and computer screens replace bomb bay windows. But the fundamental principle endures: the projection of power from above as a tool of persuasion. The B-52, astonishingly, is expected to serve until 2050 or beyond. By then, it will be a century old, a living fossil of the atomic age, still patrolling the skies of the digital one. Its long shadow stretches across generations of pilots, engineers, and adversaries who all learned to fear or respect its silhouette against the horizon. In the museums of the United States, gleaming B-52s stand on polished floors, their wingspan dwarfing the visitors below. Children walk beneath them, unaware that these machines once turned night into day over distant cities. Veterans stand silently before them, seeing not power, but memory, the reflection of a time when light itself became a weapon. There is a particular silence that follows a bombing, a silence deeper than destruction itself. It is the moment when the air stops vibrating, when the echoes fade, and the survivors emerge into a world that no longer looks like their own. For the people of Hanoi, in December 1972, that silence carried the memory of thunder, of man's ability to command light and fire as if he were summoning dawn from the void. The B-52 Stratofortress was never just an airplane. It was a statement, an embodiment of faith in technology and control, in the belief that precision and power could solve the chaos of human conflict. But beneath its sleek logic lay something older and unresolved: the ancient instinct to conquer through spectacle. The night skies of Hanoi revealed what happens when progress and fear share the same engine. In those 11 nights, humanity touched both extremes of its nature. The ingenuity that built the B-52, the metallurgy, the navigation computers, the coordination of thousands, was breathtaking. Yet that same ingenuity produced a storm so vast that it erased entire neighborhoods in minutes. We proved what we could do, but not why we should do it. Even now, decades later, the paradox endures. The B-52 remains in service, a relic of another century still casting its shadow across modern wars. It flies with digital brains and satellite eyes, yet it carries the same moral weight as it did in 1972. Every mission it flies reminds us that progress does not erase consequence. It only amplifies it. For historians, Linebacker II stands as a tactical success and a strategic question mark. For those who lived through it, it remains a memory written in light. The Americans saw victory in negotiation. The Vietnamese saw victory in survival. Perhaps both were right, and both were wrong. Because in the end, the true measure of power is not in how much light we can create, but how much darkness we are willing to bring with it. The nights when the B-52s turned darkness into day were more than a chapter in a war. They were a mirror, a reflection of mankind's dual genius, to invent the means of its own awe and its own undoing. And as those aging bombers still rise into the blue, trailing the echoes of the Cold War, they carry with them an unspoken question, whispered in the roar of their engines, lost in the thin air above. When night becomes day by human hands, what dawn are we truly chasing?